All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us today. Today, of course, is Good Friday, at least for most of you. Maybe a couple, it's already past midnight and you're on to Saturday. What better way to celebrate the Lord's crucifixion than looking at this accusation that the whole Easter celebration, whether, what we do on Good Friday, even what we do on Maundy Thursday, or of course, especially what we do on Easter Sunday, is copied from previous religions, from the pagans. We get this accusation in various different ways. Sometimes Christians will advance this and say, you shouldn't, for example, allow your kids to hunt for Easter eggs because eggs are a pagan symbol. You're indirectly supporting Satan when you allow your children to do something like that. And we get it from critics of Christianity as well, who say that there's nothing new in Christianity. It's just another religion in a long line of religions that copied from one another. Therefore, it has no real credibility. So we're going to be looking at those accusations, and we're going to be looking at the real history. We're going to be looking at, as best we can tell from history, how the customs surrounding Easter came about. Of course, we have a pretty good idea how Easter itself came about, but the customs behind it, we need to look into history, into the history of the church. As usual, we're open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with people all around the world. Right now, we have someone in the United States and someone in Germany. And in the audience, we probably have dozens of different countries represented. Thank you that we're living in this time where we are able to freely express ideas, where we are able to discuss things and be exposed to different belief systems. This gives us an unprecedented opportunity to spread the truth into societies where historically it was very difficult to do so. We ask that you be with us today and that you guide our discussion. We ask that you be with us on a personal level and strengthen us and give us the perseverance to go through this material.
Yes, Lord, I thank you that we can join together in this stream to talk about the actual history and what's developed in which way, and how we can confidently say that what we're celebrating is um, actually from you, and is actually supported by history, that it is not just a copy of different mythologies. And yeah, I thank you for the stream now, and I pray that it will be a fruitful stream. And in Jesus' name I prayed. Amen.
Amen. All righty. We have a new guest today on the channel. His name is Marvin. His channel is Gusser Globen. Oh, wait, no, that's not it. Besser Globen. There we go.
Besser glauben.
Which I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
Better believe.
Awesome. Obviously, he is German and he speaks German on his channel. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I started my channel in last year, last year in May, and I just decided, because I looked into various topics myself um, in the course of becoming a Christian, and as well as discovering several topics when I already was a Christian that I took a deeper dive into. And yeah, I just wanted to share what I got informations for myself, like what I looked up, and I want to bring that out to other people as well, so that that information gets out to very many people. And yeah, that's basically what I wanted to do, and not just one topic or one group in specific. I'm targeting various groups, like I am doing apologetics and polemics to Jews, Muslims, Unitarians, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a bunch of other groups as well, because I like to do my content in a very broad sense, so that I can actually talk to many people. And yeah, that's why I started my channel. And by God's grace, it will grow. And yeah, that's me.
Yeah, if you only started the channel a year ago and you're already up to a couple thousand subscribers, you're off to a very good start. If anyone in the audience, and I know a few of you do, speak German, be sure to check out that channel. Link is in the video description. So the first time I have guests on, I always ask them why they are a Christian.
Yeah. Why am I a Christian? Good question. I would say because of the historical data surrounding the resurrection. I really try to look into it from an atheist or agnostic perspective, and I really tried to imagine what could be a possible naturalistic explanation for the data we actually have, we actually can see, like the witnesses who are talking about these things, the sources, from Josephus to Tacitus to the letters of Paul. And we look into that whole stuff, and I can't find one single explanation that is naturalistic, that makes any sense whatsoever. And therefore, we're more or less bound to actually believe what is stated in the Bible. And therefore, I became a Christian.
Excellent. Yeah. Christianity is kind of in a unique position that it is a historical based religion, which means that you can challenge it, you can look into the history, but it also gives it the opportunity to authenticate itself if the history holds up to scrutiny. And my answer would be much the same. Then I have spent a good amount of time, 20 plus years, studying Christianity from a critical standpoint, looking at it to see if it holds up to scrutiny. And I have found time and time again that it very much does. Most of the world's religions, they don't really have this opportunity. They make claims about the unseen metaphysical world, the spiritual world, but they don't make any claims about history. So they're a little difficult to verify. Islam, of course, is a history-based religion, which is why I have personally become so interested in talking about Islam, because as a Christian, the historical argument for Christianity was always my preferred avenue for discussion. Obviously, you can defend Christianity from a variety of standpoints, but I personally really find the historical argument to be the most convincing.
Yeah.
All right, so
Couldn't
what are
agree
we going
more.
to be talking about today?
Yeah, we are going to be talking about Easter and specifically. And specifically, what are the origins of different customs that are associated to Easter? And of course, the festival itself, the date, the name. And yeah, we will look into various topics, and we'll see how far we can go. I have a presentation. Do you mind if I share it?
Yes, please do. And for the audience, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put those in the chat at any time, and I will bring them up as appropriate. We already had a comment earlier from Adiz411, who I believe is a Muslim. I'm not 100% certain, but they're definitely not a Christian. Paint the Easter eggs. Where did the bunny come from? Kind of setting the stage for us. So we'll get to see some of that material today. I have
Very
added your
interesting.
presentation to
All right.
the stream. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, all right. So first point we look into is the timing of the festival itself. So as we see in the picture, most of the time it's in April, but it also can be in March because it doesn't have a fixed date. So various people claim that it's based on just another feast from pagans that is just taken over by the Christians. And what is proposed is, for example, Nowruz. That is the festival from the Zoroastrians. But the problem here is that it's the first mention of it is in the 7th century AD. That's way past the first mentions of Easter, the first attestations, which we will come to. And also, it had a different calendar system, so it didn't have 365.25 days, but a quarter of a day less. So all 4 years would change one day in advance. So at the time that the Christian could have stolen the idea of celebrating this festival, they wouldn't even celebrate it in spring at the time. So it wouldn't be the same date as the vernal equinox. So it doesn't make sense to claim that Nowruz is the actual predecessor for Easter. Also, Nowruz is nowhere to be found in the old or young Avesta, which is the main source for Zoroastrianism. So that's a big problem. And sometimes it's claimed that the Zoroastrians in Nowruz exchanged eggs, but actually there is no ancient reference to eggs. That's just a wrong citation that is sometimes cited by people in articles and stuff, which just cite this Chambers Encyclopedia wrongly. This is found in Doan. So I have all of the sources here on the screen. So if anyone wants to look it up afterwards, they're free to do so. Yeah, and also more sources are here linked in the article.
Excellent. Yes, by all means, I encourage people to check up on the sources. Don't just take our word for it.
For sure.
Because that's how this problem starts in the first place, is that people just blindly repeat what they've heard from someone else, and they don't go back and look at any of the primary sources, and they end up repeating these ridiculous myths over and over again.
Absolutely, and that is precisely what we will see in the following slides. Yeah. Next festival that is claimed as the predecessor of Easter is Hilaria, and that is from the Romans, the ancient Romans. And here we have the first mention in the 3rd century AD in the life of Severus Alexander. And we have the first mention of the March 25th association in the 4th century AD in the Philocalian calendar. Some people know that because of the first mention of Sol Invictus for the claimants of Christmas. But here is also the first mention of March 25th in association to Hilaria, and we do not find anything before that. Also, it's sometimes claimed that on Hilaria, or at Hilaria, the resurrection of Attis is celebrated. But there is actually no such thing here, and the mythology of Attis, according to scholars, was heavily influenced by Christianity and not the other way around. And if we look the actual sources of Attis up, which I will show in a minute, you will see there is no actual resurrection. That's just as in other mythologies sometimes claimed, for example, for Romulus or Hercules or Inanna, that there was a resurrection, but there actually wasn't if you look up the sources. And as well, there is no connection between the festival of Hilaria and Attis, or the mythology of Attis, in the earliest sources for Hilaria or Attis. So that's just a claim that is made based on later sources which have no really connection to the early sources. Yeah, that's for Hilaria. And what is also often claimed is that it's based on an ancient Osterfest of the ancient Germans, so the Germani, I said here. But the problem is the Christians got only in contact with the Germanic people in 596 AD when they went to the Gregorian mission. And there they first got in contact with the Anglo-Saxons, which is way too late because we have a bunch of attestations of the Easter festival before that. And this we will look up now, because the earliest sources we have for Easter is the Peripascha from Melito of Sardis, which is in the 2nd century AD. Here, the festival of Easter is described, and it's the same in the epistle of Irenaeus to the bishop Victor of Rome, which is also in the 2nd century AD. We do not have the epistle completely, but it's cited by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History. And as well, many people know this, that in the Council of Nicaea in 325, the actual calculation of Easter was formulated, how one should determine when to celebrate Easter. And we had this in the 4th century already completely determined. And this is way before the 6th century, where the Christians first got introduced to the Anglo-Saxons.
So before you move on there, I just had to comment really quick that you brought up the Council of Nicaea, and this is, of course, we're told that this is where Jesus was invented, where he became divine, where the Trinity was invented, where the scriptures were set. But in fact, it was actually very boring. That there was the Arian debate, but that was over the technical nature of Jesus's divinity. Everyone agreed he was divine, and they set the date of Easter, which is a very highly exciting council, of course, and that's why people have made up all these myths about it, because the actual council is a little bit boring in comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we see a lot of that. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but as I mentioned before, Easter can be in March as well as in April. Most of the time it's in April. So the time span it can be is March 22nd to April 25th. And it's based on the vernal equinox. You may be wondering, but why is it based on the vernal equinox? Isn't that absolutely pagan? Well, no, it isn't. Because the date of Easter is dependent on the time of the Jewish Passover. And the Jewish Seder evening is initiated on Nisan 14th, on which date the spring full moon falls. That is the first full moon after the vernal equinox. And this is simply because the Hebrew calendar is the lunisolar calendar. This means that it is based on the orbits of the moon, but adjusted so that the years are consistent in their seasons and thus fit the solar year. This circumstance leads to the relation between the spring equinox and Nisan 14th. Since Easter should have a connection to Passover, because it is described as being precisely at the time in the Bible, but nevertheless, it was decided that Easter should always fall on a Sunday. Now it was formulated that Easter should be celebrated on the Sunday, which falls after the first full moon, which is at or after the vernal equinox. So that's basically how it is determined when to celebrate Easter in the year. This is therefore always the Sunday after Nisan 14th, with the exception of 1 year with an additional correction month in the Hebrew calendar, which in turn will result of Passover being a month later than Easter, and with the exception that when the full moon is actually a day later than Nisan 14th, because it's not always accurate, then the date of Easter will be 1 week later. And for the determination of the Easter date, we have a fixed a standardized date of March 21st for the vernal equinox. And yeah, that's basically how the date is formed.
So you're telling me that it's based on Passover, which of course is a very pagan festival, right?
Well, actually, it's Jewish, and
Oh,
it's
darn,
yeah,
darn.
and it's as well as stated in the Bible, like it's introduced there, the Passover feast, which is basically the feast that celebrates that the Jews went out of Egypt, and the Exodus is celebrated there. Yeah, and that's basically the date, and we see it's rather Jewish in its origin and not pagan. Yeah.
But now
But
we come to the name, which of course
we come to the
is a
name.
favorite source
Yeah.
of conspiracy theories. As Agape here in the chat is asking, what's the meaning of Easter? And I assume he means the term. Presumably he does know what we celebrate at Easter, but the term itself is what we come to now.
We will look into that. All right. So the name in itself. Before we actually look at the English name, we will look at different languages. How is Easter in different languages? What's the term for it? And we see all of these languages that I just have on screen right now, all of them have a form of the Greek Pascha, which comes from the Passover feast. And it's only really in German and in English where a form of Easter is used. Easter in English and Ostern in German. And all of the other languages use something different than that. Most of them, something of Pascha. And we only have languages that introduced this feast, or the name of the feast, rather late due to the colonization, for example. And some languages also have it from English or German, but all of the other languages don't have any cognate of that. So that's first interesting. And if we look further, we see we have a mention of the Eostomonath. That's in St. Bede's De Temporum Ratione. And we see that the term Easter actually comes from this month name. So from Eostomonath, which was the name for the month of April. And we see the same in German if we look at Einhard's Vita Carolae Magni, so the life of Charlemagne. And there he introduces us to the month of Ostermanoth, which is also the month name of April. And we see here, Ostermanoth is from beginning of the 9th century AD, and Eostomonath is from the beginning of the 8th century AD. And that is actually how Ostern has its name and how Easter got its name. So it's actually from the time when it was, so in April. So we will look at the passages. In Vita Carolae Magni, it says he gave the month names, and it's talking about Charlemagne, in his own tongue. For before his time they were called by the Franks partly by Latin and partly by barbarous names. He also gave names to the 12 winds, whereas before not more than 4, and perhaps not so many, had names of their own. Of the month, he called January Wintermanoth, February Hornung, March Lenzenmanoth, April Ostermanoth, and that's the important name here. And we see the other names as well, which I will not read out loud. And in Bede, we see he is talking about Eostomonath has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. So we see these are the two sources of which we can actually see where the name has its origins. But if we look further, and most people don't know this, because these sources are actually not the first sources which mention the form of Easter and which mention the form of the German Ostern. Because we see in the end of the 8th century AD the German form in a glossary which states Pascha, so the Latin form, and then Osterruhen, which is basically the same as we see with Ostermanoth. But it's only used for the feast in and of itself. And here you can see it. And the same is the thing for the English term. I will not read out loud what you can see here, but here you can see, I will, in the translated version, I will read it out. An ewe with her young sheep is worth a shilling, and that until 12 nights after Easter. And what is stated in Old English is Eastra. So we have here as well the earliest attestation of the name, which is in the end of the 7th century AD. Yeah, but what's the etymology and what's the meaning of the name? It comes from the Proto-Germanic Austra, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European Heus, and there are two possibilities to translate this. First possibility is that means dawn, and the second possibility is that means east. Now it's not just possibilities because we don't know what it means, but it has both meanings, and there's also a connection between the two. So these are the possibilities how we can translate this whole thing. So, by the way, this is for Eostermonat and Ostermanoth. If we look into April, because some people actually claim that it's from the Latin aperire, which means to open, but that is rather rejected among scholars, and more likely is that April comes from Aphrodite via the Etruscan April. Yeah, but now we see that Jacob Grimm in 1835 writes about this whole stuff, and he mentions Bede as well and Einhard, and based on the name in Einhard, he thinks that there was not only the goddess Eostre, which was described in Saint Bede, but as well there was a German goddess called Ostara, which he claims here. He says, we even today call April Ostermonat, and Ostermanoth can already be found in Einhard. This Ostara, like the Old Germanic Eastre, must have denoted a higher being of paganism, whose service had taken such firm roots that the converts tolerated the name and applied it to one of the highest Christian annual festivals. Now, Grimm simply infers from the mention of the month name in Einhard to an equivalent goddess of the ancient Germans to the mentioned Eostre in Bede. He simply assumes this connection and then tries to support it briefly afterwards with further etymological connections. This hasty conclusion by Grimm is often interpreted by scholars as characteristic for him and other authors of German Romanticism. For there are few sources in Germanic mythology, and authors like Grimm felt a strong need to discover a Germanic religion as an independent foundation of German culture, since very little is known about it. In the English version of Deutsche Mythologie, Teutonic mythology, then Grimm goes on to discuss Bede and argues why he must have passed on the truth, which he had not yet done in 1835. He says, on the other hand, the Anglo-Saxon historian tells us the names of two beings whom he expressly calls ancient goddesses of his people, but of whose existence not a trace is left amongst other Germans. You have something?
No,
Okay.
I was just laughing at that comment that he's
Okay,
supposedly
fine.
writing history and there's not a trace of evidence for their god. the god
Yeah,
names that he
okay.
claims.
Okay. Okay. Amongst other Germans. A clear proof that here as well as there, heathenism was crowded with divinities of various shape and varying name, but who in their characteristics and cultus corresponded to one another. Why this multiplicity of form should prevail more in the case of the female deities than of the male can be fairly explained, I think, by the greater respect paid to the chief masculine divinities. They were too famous and too highly thought of for the principal names not to have penetrated all branches of the nation. Well, the very obvious answer, however, as to why there is no trace at all, is that this goddess had never existed. Especially his explanation of the consistency in male gods because of their popularity contradicts, after all, the very same account of Bede. If the goddesses had been so much more unpopular than the gods, then the pagans would hardly have insisted on the name of the pagan goddess, who was much more unpopular than other gods anyways. Moreover, in that case, a month would hardly have received its name from Eostre if she was more unpopular than the male gods, and yet not a single month's name was named after one of these much more popular gods. Also, Grimm's theory here would contradict his other theory of Ostara, for if this lesser consistency
Pagan god Ishtar, and earlier from Conociendo el Islam, if I remember clearly, Ishtar was a pagan goddess, a Chaldean god. She was worshipped, and her follower offered human sacrifices, even child sacrifices. So now we're going to find out the truth of this matter. And I have a feeling, I don't want to go out on a limb, but I have a feeling that the only connection is going to be that it sounds vaguely similar.
Well, you might be right. We'll see. Okay, let's look into it. So, Ishtar. We have a chart. Maybe you know him, Zachary Bauer. Also, he has a YouTube channel. And he claims, as well as other people, that Easter derives from the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. And he made a chart trying to prove that there are very many similarities between fertility goddesses in various cultures. So, I didn't actually look every single goddess here up, but I just did it for Ostara. So we look how accurate is his depiction of Ostara. So he made 5 green. I don't actually know the check marks. He made 5 green check marks. So the first he set for fertility and springtime. I thought to myself, yeah, maybe I will just give a yellow minus for that, because in the actual sources we find a connection to the springtime, yes, and that's in the source of Bede. But for fertility, that's rather vague. We don't see it in any of the actual sources. We just find scholars debating about it. So that's a maybe. So the next thing, water, that's just wrong. That's just fabricated. Then we have sun or sunrises. And this is also like fertility. Scholars debate about it, but there's no source for it. And healing is also just fabricated. That's just flat out wrong. And connection to X does not exist at all, whatsoever. Yeah, that's basically Zachary Ball's chart. And I think we don't have to discuss it any further if we look at this. Yeah, but Ishtar. Ishtar is the Akkadian name of this Mesopotamian goddess. And we also see the name Astarte, which is the Phoenician name of the same goddess, which is a little later. It comes from the Sumerian Inanna as well. So, Modern historians and linguists consider the hypothesis of the connection between Easter and Ishtar untenable. The main reason for this is the distance of the two contexts in which these terms appeared. Ishtar is the Akkadian name for the Mesopotamian goddess. However, the question arises as to how Akkadian was supposed to influence Old English, since Akkadian died out as a written language around 100 AD and as a spoken language even around the 8th century BC. Anglo-Saxon, on the other hand, did not emerge as an independent language until the 5th century AD. So we have here a time gap of over 1,000 years. Moreover, the two places where the languages were spoken are geographically separated by a very large distance. So if such an influence would have come about, we should discover traces of the Akkadian language and especially mythology over this whole distance into Germanic Central Europe. However, this is not the case. In addition, Anglo-Saxon is a Germanic language belonging to the Indo-European languages. Akkadian, on the other hand, is a Semitic language belonging to the Afro-Asiatic languages. When languages are so different, there is much lower level of influence between these languages, as concepts are much more difficult to adopt. So even if there had been this connection, there would have been this barrier between them. In general, there is no linguistic basis for the claim to a connection to Ishtar. Moreover, from an etymological perspective, the development is exactly the opposite of what we would expect. Ishtar and Easter are assumed to be related because they sound so similar, just as you said already. However, the further development of the name Ishtar in later mythologies takes a completely different direction than Easter. If we look at the Greek Aphrodite, who, unlike Easter, actually comes from Ishtar via the Phoenician name Astarte. So the later we look into the development of Ishtar, the more dissimilar it becomes to Easter. We see the same with the precursor of Anglo-Saxon, the Proto-Germanic Austro, which also becomes more dissimilar to Ishtar. So it is unlikely that a name reverts to the original form, and the phonological similarities between the names Austro and Aphrodite is then way less, to be honest. It is often claimed by people who also reject this alleged connection that this theory was first invented by Alexander Hislop in the Two Babylons, but this is actually not true. In fact, we find this claim of the connection to Ishtar already at least since the beginning of the 18th century. Later, more about this. Interestingly, April then probably comes originally from Ishtar. Easter and the Eostromonath, however, do not. So that's that.
Yeah, I'll just say to the conspiracy theorists, don't let the facts get in the way of your conspiracy theory, because after all, you didn't have any facts to begin with. So don't worry about all these facts. Just keep repeating it, and maybe someone will believe you.
Yeah, it sounds like flat Earth a little bit. Yeah, but what about Saint Bede? Was he correct, and did this goddess Eostre actually exist? If we look at the other month names, we notice directly that none of the other month names in the Old German calendar goes back to a god, and in the Old English month names, we find only one more that is said to have its origins in the name of a god, and that's Redmonath. Here, Bede tells us that Redmonath was named after after their goddess Reda, and that they then sacrificed to her. However, there's also no mention of this goddess Reda in any source outside of Bede, just like Eostre. This casts doubt on his statements, especially with the caveat that the Old English Hreith can be translated as victory or glory, which also happens in spring, that is March, in the victory of day over night in form of the vernal equinox. More interestingly, if we look at Lensin-Manoth, which is the corresponding Old High German name for March, we see a parallel in concept. It means spring month and comes from Proto-West Germanic Langatin, which is composed of Proto-West Germanic lang, meaning long, and tin, meaning day. So Lensin-Manoth is the month in which the days are getting longer, which directly parallels the victory or glory of the Hrethmonath. So the fact that only 2 months are named after gods, and thus after seemingly such unpopular goddesses as Eostre and Rheda, who are not attested anywhere else, while not a single month name is attributed to gods like Woden or Thunor, etc., even though we have many more sources for these, and therefore they must have been much more popular, sounds very unlikely. And then we have the Modranicht, of which Bede is talking about. And on the Modranicht, Bede does show that it is solely a conjecture of his, but he mentions it anyway. So Grimm states it would be uncritical to settle this father of the church, so Bede, who everywhere keeps heathenism at a distance and tells us less of than he knows, with the invention of these goddesses. But if we actually look at this quote, that very night which we hold so sacred, they used to call by the heathen word Modranicht, that is Mother's Night, we suspect, because of the ceremonies they enacted all that night. So they don't know, maybe. And he says it anyways, so the statement of Grimm is not tenable, because Bede tells us here to the Modranicht more than he actually knows. That Bede did the same thing for the month of Hrethmonath and Eostrimonth does not seem improbable here. Now, Charlemagne chose Ostermanoth for April as the name when he reformed the names of the months, like we saw earlier in the Vita Caroli Magni. This just seems absurd if the name was actually based on a pagan goddess, considering the fact that he fought against the Germanic pagans and had the desire to Christianize them. In general, ancient and medieval etymologies are very speculative and very often simply wrong. This is mainly because people had much less available information then than nowadays. Also, Bede mentions 3 month names that have an astronomical basis for their names, which is Winterfilith and the 2 months of July. He said they called the month when the winter season began Winterfilith, a word composed of winter and full moon, because winter began on the first full moon of that month. And he says the month of July derived their name from the day when the sun turns back and begins to increase, because one precedes, so the month, and the other follows. So we actually have 3 month names which are based on something on an astronomical basis. So why shouldn't we conclude that it's probable that it's the same for these other 2 month names? It would be simply logical to do so.
How dare you bring logic into it?
Yeah, that's really not a cool move from me. I know. Yeah, but it's important to emphasize again that even in the texts like the Edda, nowhere in Eostre, Ostera, or something similar occurs. So, yeah, there are just no sources for that. So, yeah, like now to Eostre and Ostara, the evidence that is often pointed out by other neo-pagans, mainly neo-pagans, sometimes atheists, but it's mostly just neo-pagans. So yeah, we have several Germanic names which have a form of Eostre or a cognate of that. We have Easterwine, Aesterhild, Austerhild, Austregiesel, Austrowald, and Austrulf. So Germanic names do not come from seasons or month names, and some people use this as a claim as to why this should be evidence of Eostre actually existing. But the problem is, as you could say the same thing for the alleged goddess Eostre, you can say the same thing for these names as well. So this goddess could have gotten the name from the east or from the dawn or from something similar to that, and it's just the same for these names as well. Especially if we look at the translation, we see they do make sense just as much as the translation would do with the goddess Eostre. For example, these would translate to the following: the Shining Friend, the Battle of the East, the Shining Child, Hostage of the East, Ruler of the East, and Eastern Wolf. Especially this second one, Esterhild, wouldn't really make sense as a reference to Eostre, because if this alleged goddess would exist or would have existed, then it wouldn't be a war goddess. It would be something else. So this wouldn't be really logical at all. And if we also look at other names in Germanic literature, we see that the following names exist, such as Norbert, Sudbert, Nordwin, Norfried, and Wistewerga. And we see these are names in reference to the south, the north, and the west as well. So it's absolutely logical to say we have the same thing for the east. And nobody would say that because we have these names, then we have a goddess called Vestera and Nortera and Sutera. That's just stupid. Yeah. And we
Yeah,
have
the parallelism there, I think, is a pretty definitive case that, you have words that mean east and you have words that mean west. And then supposedly in one particular case, it's the name of a goddess. Doesn't really add up.
Exactly. Yeah. And we also have place names, so not just personal names. And these are called, for example, Osterode, Osterholz, Austertal, Osterbrücken, and Osterberge. But we see the same thing again. We have Westerode and Westerholz and Westertal and Westerbrück and Westerberg. So yeah, it's just the direction. It's not a goddess. Yeah, so Grimm shows that he considers it unlikely that Bede, as a Christian monk, would have made up two goddesses. But that doesn't have to be the case here at all, for he may have heard this etymology from someone else before. Neither does the etymology necessarily come from him, nor is it disputed that Bede himself was actually convinced that the names of the month had this origin. However, there are certainly goddesses who are etymologically related to Eostre. These would be Aurora, Eos, Aushirene, Auskelis, and Ushas. These words all belong to the Indo-European language family, just like Eostre. From this, it seems not improbable that already in the early stage of the language development of the Indo-European languages, a corresponding deity existed. This is reconstructed in the Proto-Germanic Austro and in the Proto-Indo-European Cheusos. However, Ushas can hardly be considered as a spring goddess, but only as a personification of the dawn, because in no source of Hinduism such a thing is described, and in India, seasons as in Europe do not exist because such a significant climatic change does not take place there. However, from this, it doesn't follow at all that Eostre actually existed, because even if there had been an early Germanic goddess of the dawn, we do not find a parallel of Eostre in the other mythologies. If there had been such a goddess in the Anglo-Saxon culture as well, we should find further evidence in sources. But these do simply not exist. Neither is a comparable goddess to be found in the Norse mythology, for example, although, of course, Old Norse belongs to the Indo-European languages as well. So to state based on this that Eostre existed is much more than these other names actually tell. Well, it is even possible that Bede himself had known these names, at least Aurora and Eos, for example, and therefore had deduced that the Eostre monad must go back to an Eostre. If one would follow this logic, these names would not be a proof for Eostre, but rather the reason why she was mentioned by Bede in the first place. Yeah, and then we have sometimes this one as a claimant of a reference to Eostre in the Edda. Especially like this actual source is in Skáldskaparmál, which is from the Edda. And here Freya is discussed, and she is called Goddess of Love. And the name that is used here is Ástagúð. But this Ástagúð is not related in any way, shape, or form to Eostre or Ostara. If we actually look up the etymology, we see that it comes from the Old Norse for love, and not from dawn or east or something like that. So there's no connection, and people just claim sometimes that it is. Then we have the Matronae Austriacenae. These are inscriptions that were found in the last century. And there are different Matronae, so not only just the Austriacenae. And we see sometimes the Matronae in Cologne. Example given here on the left side are the Matronae Axingineae. I hope that I pronounced them correctly. And they are depicted in Euboean dresses. So of the Euboeans, which is a Germanic tribe. And there are several of these inscriptions with the Euboean dresses in the area of Cologne. Now, this is an example of the Matronae Austriacenae. We see here Austriacenae. And the Austria, so this first part, can just be translated as the Easterners. And the Matronae, so the mothers, can just refer to that it is an ancestry cult of this tribe or group. So that it actually means that a god is here who is called Austria or something like that needs not to be the case. And we see, for example, that the Euboeans, so the Germanic tribe, they were earlier on the east of the Rhine, but then they settled in 38 BC west of the Rhine, which is in Cologne specifically. And we see this in the following sources. And it would make sense that if they were, to begin with, of the east side of the Rhine, and now they are at the west side of the Rhine, that they would be called the Easterners, and that it is maybe an ancestry cult of this tribe. This would absolutely make sense here, and this is how we can explain the Matronae Austriacenae. And it is not a reference to Ostara or Eostre. Another
And just all
inscription.
these connections, they all just have like logical explanations when you look at history. None of them seem to support any of the conspiracy theories. And I'm very disappointed here.
Maybe we'll find something. Let's look into it. Okay, another inscription. That's from the 2nd to the 3rd century. I don't know why I put a TH in there. But it's found in the Netherlands. And it is about a goddess called Hurstrke, actually. And this is sometimes used as a reference to Ostera or Eostre. But it's completely unrelated again, etymologically, and it's related to Hurst, which means brushwood. And also, it wouldn't be a goddess of the Anglo-Saxons or something like that. It would be a goddess of the Batavians, which is a different tribe, a different Germanic tribe. So it would be a different location, and there is simply no connection whatsoever. Then we have the Eostar-hymnus. It is first mentioned in 1853 by Nikolaus Hocker. And we see here, it's, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's in this text, it's called Eostar Eothermodor. This is what they printed here. And in a later version in 1854, we find not only the opening words of this hymnus, but the whole text as well, which is here. And the thing with this Eostar hymnus is that it was criticized very early. We have here 3 different criticisms of this hymnus, which I have here on screen. And they basically all say it's fabricated. But also we have one criticism which says that it must be legit, that must be correct. But he argues something like the author of 1854 couldn't have faked this whole thing because he just had no idea of Old German whatsoever, so he wasn't able to actually forge it. But the problem of this argument is Montanus, so the person who wrote it in 1854, that Montanus uses probably Hocker as his reference, who wrote it in 1853, the opening line, and he would have known more of the Old High German, and probably Hocker would just send him the forged text. So this is basically the problem with his argument right here. So it's just a forgery. Yeah, I even saw a neo-pagan arguing that the Eostar hymnus was authentic because it was published years before Jacob Grimm published his work Deutsche Mythologie. Yet the hymnus came out in 1853, while Grimm's Deutsche Mythologie was published as early as 1835. So yeah. All right, 18 years after that. And yeah, the alleged manuscript this whole thing is based on is lost and was never seen by anyone. All right. And yeah, it's basically a forgery based on a different text we have, which is the Ekerbot. And this is actually from the 11th century. And we see, if we compare those two, which are on screen right now, that is basically just a copy from it. Yeah, then we have the next reference, the next source, which is the Beschreibung der Saale, der Sala from 1744. And he's also writing about the goddess Ostera, even though it is before the work of Jacob Grimm in 1835, in which he discusses this Osterer based on the entry in Ehenhard. But what we will see here is that here is a connection made to the Mesopotamian goddess Astarte Ishtar again, which is obviously just wrong. So the author just makes a connection based on the sound of the words. And that's how he came up with Osterer here as well, which is underlined. And this is a problem with many sources that we will find, which neo-pagans claim as evidence of Eostre or Osterer. Because many sources are actually before Jacob Grimm made this whole thing up. Another reference is here in a Dutch manuscript or in a Dutch work from 1711, which mentions Osterer, and he's quoting Johann Schild, as we see in the last line of the entry. So we will just look at what this Johann Schild wrote, and we will see he wrote in 1649, and he basically quotes Bede. That's it. But he claims that Bede said the goddess was called Osterer, which is just wrong. And yeah, that's basically it. So there's no contemporary mention of anything there. It's just a mention of Bede, and that's it. Then we have the Ortschronik of Pastor Pustkuchen in 1762, which is another alleged text. And it says something like, "At these stones, the ignorant people make a lot of mischief with the pagan goddess Osterer." Now, the quote of Pastor Pustkuchen does not seem to exist at all, but it is rather completely different. If we look in another source, which is not the Ortschronik or the Chronik of this pastor, it's in a journal. It's called Lippisches Intelligenzblatt, and it's not from 1762, but from 67. And we will see in Der Eggerster Stein im Fürstentum Lippe a wrong reference of this source as 1762, which is probably how this 1762 thing originated at all. And yeah, we see, if we make it a little bit larger, that he also says some things here which have the problem that it just is referencing Bede from the things that he says here, such as Eastar or Eostra, and that it was celebrated in April, which we will see here. That is basically using a lot of information that is just found in Bede, and it's pretty obvious that he just uses Bede as a source, and it's not a contemporary source of anything. And also he makes an etymological error, because he claims that Externsteine comes from Eostre, which it does not. It comes from Egge, which is etymologically completely unrelated to Eostre as well. So he just reports here speculation of ancient times, and it's not contemporary. The same thing we find in 1750, where also a mention of the Externsteine, which is just a stone formation, is made here, and it's called Eostre Rupes. And this pastor who's writing here, the author, also makes origin of the word up to Eostre, which is, again, simply wrong. Then we have Karl von Münchhausen, who's writing in a German journal, and he writes quite a lot of this. I will just blend it in here. Anything for anyone who wants to look that up later, could maybe pause in the later stream. Yeah, and we see here a depiction of an alleged tablet, votive tablet, which we will discuss in a minute. But Münchhausen has the problem that he also has this pseudo etymology of a connection to Astarte and Ishtar. So it's reused again, and it's even presented as a fact in here. And Münchhausen mainly refers to the statements of a pastor called Paulus zu Möllenbeck. And this pastor probably, from which he says, knows Bede, which is kind of obvious in the writing that you will read here. Yeah, and he also refers to this Oster stone, which is the tablet that I pointed out. And the drawing that you'll see here of the tablet was allegedly found in a Münchhausen castle. And Karl's ancestor, who's called Ludolf von Münchhausen, supposedly mentioned this stone in the writing Mein Leben und Reisen, but this source cannot be located, so it probably doesn't exist. Yeah, and
It's
this
just a
is
shame that we keep
Yeah.
looking at all these sources and gods that don't exist. It's almost like everyone's just copying from one source, and that there are no real sources for any of this stuff.
It seems like it. Yeah. Then we have this Osterstone, which is called in German Runentafel vom Hohenstein. And yeah, the problem with this is that, or we will come to the problems. It is an inscription which says something like "Du gauter Oster, us ils in Frosta," which would translate to "the good Oster, all of his frost for us," which doesn't really make sense, but yeah, that's and it's just runic inscriptions, and yeah, it's allegedly found in the 16th century, but no mention of that. So the first mention of it is just the article we just saw in Münchhausen in 1798. And it's
Before you go on,
debunked.
I just want to
Yeah.
comment on that inscription. All is frost for us, as if frost is
Yeah.
something good, right? It'll kill your crops. Praise the God for bringing the frost that kills our crops.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Yeah, and basically it's just pointed out that it's a forgery in 1867. The main problems are that it's Nordic runes instead of German runes, and there's no logical use of the tablet whatsoever. And there's the font that is continuing just in the parallel line at the bottom, but it actually would be just continuing like in kind of a circle, so in the perpendicular line, which is just ahistorical what is done here. And yeah, the language is just a mixture of High German and Low German of the 16th to the 18th century, and some Old Saxon or pseudo Old Saxon suffixes. So it's just a mess. And yeah, a lot of other problems as well, as you can see here. So it's just poorly forged. Yeah, then continue to the old the cast brought this one up, and this is first mentioned in 1859 from Georg Sappert in Über ein Althochdeutsches Schlummerlied, and it's allegedly, as he claims, from the 9th to the 10th century, and it says Ostra stelikinde honak eger suosi, which means Ostra presents the child's honey eggs sweet. Yeah, and it's demonstrated as a forgery in very much detail by Grohmann in 1861. It's really a large work, so it's really huge. So yeah, that's also just a forgery. We will have a lot of forgeries here, actually.
Yeah, strange that, if there's all this evidence for these pagan deities, that they have to make forgeries about them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we have in 1709 also a quite early source from Leukfeld in Antiquitates Gandersamensis. And he also gives reference when he's talking about Ostar, that he gives reference to the goddess Astarte. So basically the same thing we heard over and over again in the last few sources, which also have this wrong connection to Astarte. So basically nothing to be gained from this source either. Then we have a source from Ernst Casimir Wasserbach, and he's also talking about Ostera, which is a goddess near Osterholz, so one of these place names we heard earlier. But also he is just speculating about ancient times, talking about nothing contemporary, so nothing but conjecture. Then we have Georg Roth in De Ostera Saxonum in 1723. And this is actually, as far as I can tell, the first association of Ostera as a fertility goddess. I did not find any source before this that claims exactly this, but this source already does. And also, it's another reference to Astarte, the same problem over and over again. And he also quotes Bede directly in the same work in page 5. So, yeah, he basically just takes over the same thing from different authors as well. And now we have the earliest source of this Astarte problem, which is Luneberg Mussart in the so the title is the same as in the source before from 1723, and it's from 1702, and it also discusses a goddess called Ostera of the Saxons, which is in relation to Astarte and Ashtaroth, as he claims. And he's the earliest source I could find for this whole thing with Ishtar, Astarte, and this whole nonsense. So thank you, Luneberg Mussart. And pretty much the same thing in the Ziegler lexicon from both volumes in 1734 and 1740, which also claims this whole thing with Astarte, and he clearly makes reference and explicitly makes reference to Bede and to Luneberg Mussart, which we just saw as well, which you can see here in the lines below, which are given in the reference. So yeah, here also the links to the whole thing, and also he just copies the whole thing again. Then we have another pastor, and this is actually cited in the German Wikipedia article of Ostera, and even Wikipedia says that's just conjecture based on Bede. So nothing to be said here. Yeah, and then we have the Wernigerödisches Intelligenzblatt, which you actually cannot find online anywhere. So I went to the archive to look that one up. And if you find it on the internet as a reference, then you will constantly see it, and there's no, as I can find, there's no other reference which would actually do it correctly. They always cite it wrongly as the May 9th, but it's from May 2nd. And here it is reported that the rural neighbors lit sacrificial fires for the pagan goddess Ostra. However, we notice after further investigation that this mention isn't really relevant. First, we read that idolatry was again brought forth. That means that it was therefore not an unbroken tradition. but it is much more relevant that it says, perhaps in the future they will be ashamed of their superstition if they now learn that they are offering their fuel to a pagan goddess. So it becomes clear that the alleged idolaters do not even know that they are serving the goddess Ostra. Thus, all alleged evidence of an Ostra cult is gone and in this source, and it is simply a description of an ecclesiastical scholar who thinks that the Easter fires, which is a German custom, which we will also come to, are related to paganism. So we do not see an actual sacrificial service here. So the author was simply influenced by the literature we had already discussed. Moreover, it says of these rural inhabitants that at least they are very decent in their churches, which thus means that they are Christians and not pagans. All right, that was actually all the evidence for Eostre and Ostara. So that's it.
Excellent. So I see
yeah.
we're about to move on to the bunny. I assume that means that we're done with the pagan deities, correct? Because there was a question.
Yeah, we are.
that I wanted to
We
bring up.
are.
Okay, yeah. So earlier Idris said, wouldn't the god Atar / Astar, i.e. the morning star, be a better candidate for the origin of Easter than the goddess Istar? No. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm not sure which gods he actually means, because
Yes.
I can't remember any god that is called Atar, and Astar would be probably only in the references that we saw earlier, which just wrongly references Beat, but I don't know any of that. So yeah, I don't think they exist.
So I did look it up. Atar is a god, apparently. Atar is an ancient Semitic deity whose role, name, and even gender varied by
Semitic
cultures in
again.
West
Okay.
Asia, identified with the planet Venus. And I'm sure that this god died out long before the advent of Christianity, which makes it very improbable that it could be a influence.
Yeah, I thought it was as well in the European, I just assumed. But yeah, then obviously it's the same problem as with Ishtar as well. The language barrier problem, then the distance problem, and the time factor. So basically all the same as an Ishtar.
Yeah, the same criticisms would apply. There's a long disconnect in time, long disconnect in geography, and the only reason it's being proposed is because it sounds similar. And that wasn't the original term for Easter. That only comes into existence in German and English, which, of course, the earliest Christians were already celebrating Easter and we're not speaking German or English. So it's not very credible.
Yeah, precisely. Do you have any other questions?
Nope. There is, one about where the chicks and eggs and bunnies come from, and we're about to get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Then let's get on with the Easter Bunny. So, there is the legend of Ostra. It goes like this. Once, when the goddess was late in coming, a little girl found a bird close to death from the cold and turned to Eostre for help. A rainbow bridge appeared, and Eostre came, clothed in her red robe of warm, vibrant sunlight which melted the snows. Spring arrived. Because the little bird was wounded beyond repair, Eostre changed it into a snow hare, who then brought rainbow eggs. As a sign of spring, Eostre instructed the little girl to watch for the snow hare to come into the woods. Well, but there are just simply no actual sources for this claim, so that's it. And then we have a story for Semiramis, which is that Semiramis, the Queen of Heaven, was born again as the goddess Easter, or Astarte, as she emerged from a giant egg that landed in the Euphrates River at sunrise on the sun day after the vernal equinox. To proclaim her divine authority, she changed a bird into an egg-laying rabbit, but again, there are no actual sources for this claim. It probably just goes back to embellishments at the end of the 19th century of the whole Osterer story, which started from Jacob Grimm and people like that in German Romanticism. So probably just is based on that. And the embellishments precisely go back to Holzmann, probably in his work Deutsche Mythologie. So it's the same name as the work from Jacob Grimm. And he says, by the way, the hare was a bird because it lays eggs. So some people just used this quote probably and thought this must mean that the bird was transformed into a hare or something like that. But Holzmann is just speculating about an early Easter bird, which through tradition gets into the Easter bunny. So he wasn't actually talking about any transformation or something like that. And even Alexander Hislop in The Two Babylons doesn't mention the story, well, because it didn't exist back then. And sometimes it is claimed that the connection of the Easter hare to Ostara is first asserted by Jacob Grimm. However, Grimm never mentions such a thing once. This claim is based on a misunderstanding of Adolf Holzmann's source, which is Deutsche Mythologie, which has the same name as Jacob Grimm's work, Deutsche Mythologie. So yeah, this is the quote of Holzmann you can see on the left. And this is basically, you will find it sometimes online, it's something like, the Easter bunny is inexplicable to me, something like that. You will find it. It's often stated that it is from Grimm. Yeah, and then we have a quote from Saint Ambrose from the end of the 4th century AD in Hexaemeron. And he says, what we can learn most easily from the hares is that their fur turns white in winter, while in summer the color undoubtedly returns. This leads me to say that on the faith in the transformation that will consist in the resurrection, this example challenges us, but in such a way that we say of that transformation what the apostle expressed in all clarity thus, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Thus quoting Corinthians. And this is used as a reference to the symbolism of the hare in Christianity and how it is a relation to the Easter bunny. But although it is referencing a hare, there's nothing what is actually connected to Easter specifically, or any eggs or something like that. So it's basically just a mention of a hare, which is not connected to the later Easter bunny we find in tradition. Then we have a mention of the Easter bunny, which is also often stated from 1572 in a German source. And it goes like this if you look it up in the English references. It says, do not worry if the bunny escapes you. Should we miss his eggs, we will cook the nest. You will find not a single reference of this quote in any English reference whatsoever. It's just never cited. But you can find it if you look it up in German. And it goes like this. Sorg nicht, dass dir der Has vom Spieß entlauf. Haben wir nicht die Eier, so braten wir das Nest. So anyone who knows German knows that this translation is absolute garbage. That's not at all what is stated here. So what it actually stated in English would be, do not worry that the hare escapes you from the roasting spit. If we do not have the eggs, then we will cook the nest. So there are only, in this one quote, there are 5 mistakes. I'm not sure who made this translation, but it's so wrong. It's just so wrong. So this from the roasting spit, they just omitted that completely. I don't know why, but okay. And it's also not his eggs, and yeah, it's just so many mistakes. But if we look up in the German references, then we find in 1933 a reference of this exact source, which, as I said before, you can't find a reference in the English sources. So the reference given is here, Fischart in aller Praktik Großmutter from 1572. So, as we saw earlier, it's an absolute wrong translation. But there's a second problem, and that is, in the source given, it is not included. We see here 2 sentences which I emphasized. And we see in a later edition, in 1607, it is included, but not in 1572. So that is a wrong citation, first of all. Second of all, if we have these sentences in 1607 and we compare that with other German literature, then we see this cannot possibly be a reference to the Easter Bunny, because it actually is just 2 different sayings after one another. So we have 2 different sayings. The first one is sorg nicht, dass dir der Hass vom Spieß entlauf, which is, do not worry that the bunny escapes you from the roasting spit. And the second quote, or the second saying, which is, haben wir nicht die Eier, so braten wir das Nest, which is, if we do not have the eggs, we shall cook the nest. So these are just sayings which are used by Fischart later in 1607, but it is not a reference to the Easter Bunny at all. And here are the sources to see that it is actually, that these are actually sayings. And we see, for example, in 1949, that in German, this is wrongly stated as a reference to the Easter Bunny, which is just not the case. And English authors probably took that as well, which is first stated by Francis Weiser in the Easter Book in 1954, and copied from him from Jacqueline Simpson in A Dictionary of English Folklore, and Tanya Gulevich in Encyclopedia of Easter, Carnival and Lent. But the quote is just wrong, so no. What is the actual first source for the Easter Bunny? That is Georg Frank von Frankenau in Satyrae Medica, which is from 1682. So that's over 100 years later. And it says, in Upper Germany, in our Palatinate, in Alsace, and in neighboring places such as Westphalia, these eggs are called hare eggs because of the fable with which one tells mentally weak and children that the hare, the Easter hare, lays such eggs and hides them in the grass in the gardens, so that they are searched for all the more eagerly by the children, to the amusement of the smiling adults. So this is the actual earliest source that we have for the Easter Bunny. And we have no source, at least to our knowledge, to our current knowledge, that is earlier than that. So how did the Easter Bunny actually come about then? It is probably the case that because the Easter Bunny is associated with springtime, because he comes out in springtime and he wasn't outside, you can't see him outside in Germany in winter because it's too cold. and they will start to come outside in the spring. Therefore, he is associated with springtime, in which just the Easter time also happens to be in. And therefore, it's just that this association to the Easter Bunny came about. It's nothing symbolically. It's nothing with a deep meaning. It's just simply simple folklore. Nothing complex.
Excellent. So I have a couple comments from Clo, which I think now would be a good time to bring this
Yeah.
up. Clo is a Muslim. He said, can you explain how bunny Easter eggs such a influence in Christianity, and why my point, pagan influence ideology so embedded with Christianity, is that not concerning? So Clo, pay attention here. First of all, the first mention of this Easter bunny is 1682. Christianity began in the year 30. That's 1652 years later. It's not deeply embedded in Christianity. Second of all, there's no evidence that this is a pagan culture or influence from paganism in any way. As Marvin just pointed out, a perfectly logical connection here between the springtime, when Easter is, and the things that people eventually adopt as customs for what they do as part of the Easter celebration. But it has nothing to do with Christian doctrine, and there's no evidence it has anything to do with paganism either. Anything you want to add?
Exactly.
So while we're paused here, Ballrider just joined the stream, and he said, can you do a recap? I just dropped in, and it's not clear what is going on here. So you want to let Ballrider and anyone else who joined late know what we are discussing and why we're looking at these quote unquote random sources from 1682.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. So we are looking today about different claims that come about from atheists, neo-pagans, Muslims, Unitarians, you name it. And the claims are different traditions that Christians adopted from pagans into the celebration of Easter, or the celebration of Easter in and of itself, if that is pagan. And we looked at different claims of the date. Is the date copied from any other pagan feasts that predates Easter? And we looked at the name. Is the name in and of itself pagan? And we looked into the existence of a goddess that is connected often from various people to Easter. And we looked to the connection to Ishtar, if there exists a connection at all. And we looked into the tradition of the Easter Bunny, so how that originated. So that are basically the points that we discussed before.
And one more from Clo as a follow-up to what I just said. So why do 99% of Christian school children celebrate it? Well, first of all, your stat is no doubt wrong. I'm sure that 99% of Christian children don't collect, and by it, I'm assuming you mean an Easter egg hunt or the Easter bunny. To answer your question, why do children celebrate it? Because it's a fun activity to have with children. There's no theology involved in an Easter egg hunt. It's just a fun activity. Don't confuse theology for what you do. I'm sure that as a Muslim child, you played games that had nothing to do with Islam, and wouldn't expect Christians to go around saying, oh, you see, you're worshiping pagans by playing a game that has nothing to do with Islam. It's just a game that people do at Easter. That's all.
That should be considered haram, definitely. Yeah, like the source is just stating, to the amusement of the smiling adults as well. So yeah. Do you have any other questions, or should I continue?
You can continue on.
All right. Then we have also a reference that is rarely made, but sometimes, and that is to this statue, which supposedly is an ancient statue of Eostre and the Easter Bunny. But actually, it's just a Mayan goddess. Period. Yeah,
That's
okay.
hilarious.
Easter eggs. Easter eggs. How did they come about? Ishtar and the Easter eggs. Also, a connection to Ishtar is proposed. So, although people like to say this, the symbols of Ishtar were neither rabbits nor were they eggs. Symbols associated with her were the 8-pointed star and the lion. However, what actually exists is a mention in Hyginos, and it goes like this. Into the Euphrates River, an egg of wonderful size is said to have fallen, which the fish rolled to the bank. Doves sat on it, and when it was heated, it hatched out Venus, who was later called the Syrian goddess. Since she excelled the rest in justice and uprightness by a favor granted by Jupiter, the fish were put among the number of the stars, and because of this, the Syrians do not eat fish or doves, considering them as gods. Well, Venus is identified with Ishtar, and that's about it. However, this is also the only source that makes such a connection to Venus. This indicates that the story was not widespread. In other narrations, Venus is born from a shell. Aside from the fact that there is an egg in this story, there is no other reference to Easter or painted Easter eggs whatsoever. Also, if this story would have been related to Easter, the question would arise why the hare was then identified with Easter and not fish or dogs. Also, the other animals, which were earlier identified with Easter in Germany, which would be the Easter stork, the Easter fox, or the Easter cuckoo, do not show any connection to this story. However, it may well be that the later Semiramis story that we discussed earlier from the 19th or 20th century was influenced by this. That's quite possible. So then we have the claim, which is also claimed on Wikipedia, for example, of which it is said that Easter eggs are said to have come from the ancient Mesopotamian Christians, and they painted their eggs red in symbol of the blood of Jesus Christ. Just like the reference I pointed out here. But this is just a misunderstanding of a quote in Hyde, which is called De Ludis Orientalibus, the work. And he was just speaking about Mesopotamian Christians, but not about ancient Mesopotamian Christians. So he was just writing in the end of the 17th century, and he was just writing about the customs of his contemporary Mesopotamian Christians, and people just thought, okay, that has to be ancient Mesopotamian Christians, but he didn't even claim that. So yeah, that's just not true. Then this is also a source that is quite often stated, and you can read it as well here in Tanya Gulevich's Encyclopedia of Easter Carnival and Lent, and the quote is the following. So it's not a quote that she says it is a quote, but this is a quote of her book. And she says, in 1219, King, not kind, Edward I of England had his servants prepare 450 Easter eggs by boiling them and covering them with gold leaf. He presented them to members of his household on Easter Sunday. So we look it up. And the problem with this source that Tanya Gulevich claims is Tanya Gulevich uses a source who uses a source who uses a source who uses a source. and a lot of information gets lost there. It was really hard to find the original source, but I finally did it. It's in Archaeologia 15 from 1806, and it is an excerpt of the original manuscript of the list from King Edward I. But it simply claims that King Edward I bought 450 eggs for Easter. And everything besides that is not included in the actual source. And this is in Latin, and here you see it in English translated. So where does she have the additional information from? It's actually just from the footnotes and not from the actual text. So in the text that the excerpt is presented, as I just pointed out, there's a footnote from the author. And in the footnote, he says, part of these 450 of eggs might have been purchased for the purpose of being stained with various colors and given as Easter presents to the royal household, a custom which generally prevailed in Catholic times and taken in token of the resurrection and still continues in the Greek church. And in another work from the same author, John Brandt, he says in another footnote, highly interesting to the investigator of our ancient manners, not so much on account of the smallness of the sum which purchased them, as for the purpose for which so great a quantity was procured on this day in particular, i.e., in order to have them stained in boiling or covered with leaf gold, there we have it, and to be afterwards distributed to the royal household. So it's not actually found in the original text, but in footnotes that discusses the text. So it might very well be that this is what happened, but it isn't stated in the original source. But it's probably actually a reference to Easter eggs or to the developing custom of Easter eggs, but just not with leaf gold or anything like that. We also find a different source claimed in Ducange in one of his Latin glossaries, and he says that in the Tabularium Fossatense, which I'm not very sure of which source he actually means, maybe the Cartulary of Foss, I'm not sure. And he says something about ova de crucibus, which is eggs of the cross, which might refer to Easter eggs, but it is not sure. And also, we find an earlier source than 1290, which is in 1270 in the Cartula of Cluny, which is printed in Bibliotheca Clunia Kansas from 1614. And here it is stated that the dean of the house of Perona, which is a medieval monastery, received eggs at Easter, and many eggs. So this is probably the same custom as we see in 1290 for King Edward I. And this is 20 years earlier. But we also do not find any source before this, which states any relation to Easter eggs. So this is also a later custom which evolved in the medieval periods. Yeah, that's basically. Oh, I haven't discussed that. Okay, wait a minute. So, how did Easter eggs actually derive? Because we looked at what's the earliest source. How did they derive? They come from Lent. That means the Christians weren't able to eat animal products during Lent, so the 40-day fast before Easter. And because they weren't able to eat any animal products, they couldn't eat eggs, of course. But the chicken, they obviously continue to lay eggs. So because of that, they will have a lot of eggs left over at the time Easter arrives. And in this period, they will boil the eggs in order to be able to eat them afterwards, so that they will not just mold. And because of that, you will have many boiled eggs at the time Easter arrives. And this is basically how the whole thing with the Easter eggs came about, because of that. That's the easy answer.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great clarification, that because Christians were fasting in the sense of abstaining from particular foods for the 40 days prior to Easter, they had an abundance of eggs that had built up. And of course, eggs don't keep very long, especially in the days before refrigeration. So they boiled
Yeah.
them. And then they celebrated Easter where they could eat these foods again, because the fast or abstention from those particular foods was over by eating those eggs. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And then we go on with hot cross buns, which is actually a tradition that we don't know in Germany, but I looked it up. And for hot cross buns, there is an alleged origin of it from the Chaldeans, according to Alexander Hislop, in the two Babylons, obviously without sources whatsoever. But there's another alleged origin from the Greek, also by Alexander Hislop. So probably he couldn't really decide where it was from. Yeah, and it's based on an absolute garbage translation of Jacob Bryant's of a Greek word, and he just did a really weird translation, which was not at all what was stated there. And Hislop just copied the same reasoning of Jacob Bryant, and that's where he got that from. But the actual first mention of hot cross buns is in the Poor Robin's Almanac from 1733. I wasn't able to locate that, but I saw the reference in A History of the Cries of London, Ancient and Modern, which it is referenced there, which is also not very much later than that. And yeah, that is actually the first mention of hot cross buns we see, and before that, there's just nothing. And also, there is no such thing as a reference, as a relation to any ancient custom. Then Lent, we already discussed the whole thing with the Easter eggs in regards to Lent, but Lent in and of itself is sometimes said to come from the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz. So the Lent is 40 days, and it is sometimes claimed that it comes from the 40-day weeping for Tammuz. Oh, and Tammuz is a Babylonian god, by the way. Although this may sound tempting, there are no sources for this claim that there was a 40-day period of weeping for Tammuz. However, we found this claim, as one could have guessed, in Alexander Hislop. In the actual Babylonian and also other ancient sources, however, there is no mention of it. The only thing that is often mentioned here is Ezekiel 8:14, where the mourning for Tammuz by women is reported. Nowhere, however, does it say anything about 40 days. Apart from the fact that there is no evidence of this 40-day weeping, the month of Tammuz was also not in March or April, but in June. So to make any connection here is, as pretty much always with Hislop, just absurd. In fact, fasting or Lent goes back to something else, and this is also already attested by Athanasius in 331. And it says, the beginning of the fast of 40 days is on the 5th of Faminoth, and when, as I have said, we have first been purified and prepared by those days, we begin the Holy Week of the Great Easter on the 10th of Pharmuthi, in which, my beloved brethren, we should use more prolonged prayers and fastings and watchings, that we may be enabled to anoint our lintels with precious blood and to escape the destroyer. Let us rest then on the 15th of the month Pharmuthi. So, the custom of Lent simply derives from the 40 days of Jesus in the desert, which are reported in Mark 1 as quoted above by Athanasius. It's nothing from any ancient pagan custom whatsoever. It's entirely Christian.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that we would derive our custom from, Jesus spending 40 days in the desert, not a tradition that probably didn't even exist of a Babylonian god that no one knew about by the time Christianity arose. And those 40 days being reflective of the 40 years that Israel spent wandering in the desert all connects together. But, ignore all that and just create a conspiracy theory out of an imaginary festival for a god that didn't exist by the time of Christianity.
Yeah. But it sounds good, so.
Yeah, it sounds good for sure.
All right. Okay, next up, we have Easter bonfires. That's actually mainly a thing in Germany and Austria sometimes, but not in many countries. On the left side, we have the liturgical Easter fire, and on the right side, we have the secular, I would call it, Easter bonfire, which is in rural areas. So, as to the origins of this bonfire, it is sometimes stated that it comes from St. Patrick. In this source that I have up here, St. Patrick is reported to have ignited, I don't know, he made a fire. And this fire was an answer to the pagans of Ireland. But also it was connected to the liturgical Easter fire as we see in this passage. So, as it is stated here in yellow by me, St. Patrick, then celebrating Holy Easter, kindles the divine fire with its bright light and blessed it which was shining brightly in the night, being seen by almost all the inhabitants on the flat plain. So this is taken as reference to the origins of this Easter fire. Problems. Easter bonfires are not in Ireland. So to say that it comes from St. Patrick, who lived in Ireland, and he did it in Ireland as well, but we see nothing in Ireland, that's a little curious. And then we also see that there's more likely to be a connection of the fire of St. Patrick to the liturgical Easter fire and not the secular Easter bonfire. So that's probably a different sort of Easter bonfire, which is not connected to the Easter bonfire, which allegedly has pagan roots. And also there is no trace of this custom from Ireland to Germany whatsoever. So this seems to be only conjecture and nothing but that. Then a different possibility we have here in the letters of Saint Boniface, what actually is a letter of Pope Zachary to Saint Boniface, and he is responding to him. And it goes like this. Now concerning the Paschal fire, Easter fire, about which you inquired, since the time of our saintly fathers of old, when the church was established, when the church was dedicated, through the grace of God and our Lord Jesus Christ, and by his precious blood, on Thursday of Holy Week, while the sacrament is being consecrated, 3 large lamps, fueled by a copious supply of oil, which had been collected from the various lamps in church, will be tended with great care and will burn continuously in a remote part of the church, recalling the flame of the inner tabernacle. There is sufficient oil to last until the 3rd day. From these lamps, fire will be taken on Holy Saturday for the sacred baptism at the font, and will be rehallowed by the bishop or by priest. As you have made mention of crystals, we have no tradition of using them. So this is the answer we get from Pope Zachary to St. Boniface. Now, from this source, it is not evident from the text that there ever was such a custom of a Paschal fire or Easter fire among the pagans. It is just described a fire, but it is not sure if Boniface is just asking about the traditions of the church without a reference of what he was seeing at the time he was in the Germanic area, or if it was actually the case that he saw a specific custom among the pagans, and he was just asking if that would be what was a tradition in the church as well. So that is not clear from the text, so we can't really say anything further on that. Also, if that would be the case, that was a custom among the pagan Germans, this possible procedure was not clear, since we have not the actual letter of St. Boniface to Pope Zachary. We only have the answer of Pope Zachary, and therefore we can't really say if this alleged custom was in any way similar to that what we have nowadays. And as well, there was a mention of crystals to the fire that was discussed, and we don't have any connection to crystals in the modern Easter bonfire, so that would also be a point of dissimilarity, which would lead us to think that it is not the same here discussed. Then there's also a third possible origin, which we find in a German source from Johannes Timaeus in De Igne Paschali from Osterfeuer. And he writes in 1590 that the tradition of the Easter bonfire goes back to a burning of all statues, idols, altars, etc. of the Saxons, which happened in the time of Charlemagne and was initiated by him. The Christ-believing Saxons, as he writes, wanted to keep this event in remembrance and had therefore decreed that a fire was to be lit on Easter to commemorate it. Easter would be a fitting date because Jesus had achieved victory over death, just as the victory over the idols was achieved here. This last part with that would be a fitting date is from me. That's not actually stated in the source. Now, is this story likely? No, probably not. The problem here, of course, is that 1590 is almost 800 years after the event. Of course, it is possible that the tradition described is actually that old, but one should not assume that. However, it does describe an actual possible origin, which, given the lack of sources, shows that Easter fires quite logically may have a completely non-pagan origin. Therefore, there is no good reason to assume something different. And here is the relevant page. Then we will come to a pretty similar custom, which is also pretty much only in Germany, and also not in the entirety of Germany, but just a few villages. But it's traditionally connected to Easter, so we'll discuss it. Yeah, and it is said of these Easter wheels, so it is basically just wheels which are inflamed, so they are on fire, and they are being rolled downhill. And yeah, that's basically the custom. I don't know why, but that's the custom. And it's mainly in a village called Lugde. And now it is said that Charlemagne has adopted the formerly pagan Easter wheels into a Christian custom during his stay in Lugde, so this village. Because of him, they got the name Easter wheels, and the spokes should represent a cross since then. However, the obvious answer as to why two beams, thus in the form of a cross, are used is that they represent the simplest and most economical type of construction. That Charlemagne should have Christianized the Easter wheels in Lugde seems highly unlikely, not only because of the lack of sources for it since the beginning of the attestations of the Easter wheels in Lugde, much more because in the same annals, because we see here in the Annales Regni Francorum, there is a mention that Charlemagne stayed in this village called Lugde, and he celebrated Christmas there. But if we read the annals, if we continue in reading the annals, then we will see that directly after the entry of the Christmas celebration of Charlemagne in Lugde, it is written that he moved on and stayed the whole winter in a village called Rime or Reme. So if he had left Lugde already very shortly after Christmas, a knowledge of customs of the people of Lugde at springtime seems completely improbable. Even if this very improbable circumstance would have occurred, the Lugde inhabitants would hardly have been influenced by an instruction by him if he had already moved away far for more than 3 months and stayed there only for a few days as well. Moreover, the distance between Reme and Lugde, as you can see here on the right on maps, is here too large to claim that he was still exposed to the inhabitants of Lugde during his stay in Reme. Also, it seems unlikely that Charlemagne would simply Christianize a pagan custom by a Christian symbol, since he had fought fiercely against the pagan Saxons, such as Widukind, for example. However, considering the fact that Lugde has an early mention in the annals and thus is associated with Charlemagne, it just seems logical that such a tradition has developed in regards to the Easter wheel to offer the town an even more colorful and decorated history of the village. Pride of tradition and attachment to the homeland seem to have been important factors in this regard. As for the earliest mention of these Easter wheels, we have from the village itself, so Lugde, a quote in which they say, "How old our custom is cannot be determined, since there are no or hardly any early records. It is not possible to prove that this custom goes back to the pagan Germanic times." So, the first mention of these Easter wheels is in Würzburg by a man called Johann Böhme. And he basically explains the same custom, and this is in 1520. Before that, we do not have something like that. But we have a first mention of fire wheels, so not specifically connected to Easter. And this is in the Codex Laurisamensis, and this is from March 21st in 1090. But we see that the mention in the Codex Laurisamensis do not describe the same event of the Easter wheel, because the fire wheels here are rather small burning wooden discs and were thrown into the air, hitting the church spire. So this tradition is the predecessor of the Easter wheel. It would directly refute the pagan origin story around Charlemagne. Then we also have one source in the Acta Sanctorum. And here the Acta Sanctorum talks about Vincent of Argent, who had lived in the 4th century, and here is a report of a burning wheel. And this burning wheel is said to have come down a hill, and it also is just that we see sort of in the later traditions, as we just discussed. And this is from the Gauls. Although this mention is probably the strongest source for a connection of the Easter wheel to pagan traditions, a few problems arise here nevertheless. First, the tradition was not compiled until the 8th to the 9th century. Even if the story can really be traced back to the given time, this is not secured hereby. What is clear, however, is that there is a mention of pagans in connection to a burning wheel in the 8th to the 9th century. However, in this tradition is no time of the year indicated, whereby a reference to the Easter time would be at best conjecture. However, this conjecture does not seem to be on a good basis when we notice that the incident happens here in Argent, that is southwest France. However, we do not find any attestation of Easter wheels in France. In France, on the other hand, we find attestations of fire wheels since the late Middle Ages, but they say nothing about customs around Easter, but of the summertime, so in June. These fire wheels, which also exist in southern Germany in the summer, are therefore related to the midsummer period. The Easter wheels, on the other hand, are found in northern Germany. As I said already, no time of the year is mentioned, but if one were to make a guess, it would be in summer and not in spring. So, for the assumption of the connection between the Easter wheel and the mention in the Acta Sanctorum, the traces from France to Germany are missing. Furthermore, this theory would be contradicting a connection to the ancient Germans as well, since it would be a custom of the Celts and not of the Germans, which would have spread over southern Germany to northern Germany, and the time must have been changed from summer to spring. But all this, however, is the best conjecture and cannot be demonstrated by actual sources. And yeah, that's the last custom we discussed.
Excellent. Yeah, Mary made a comment earlier along the lines of people like fire. If they're cold, they start a fire. Hey, why not make it bigger? You don't really need like some conspiracy theory as to why people would start having big bonfires or
Yeah,
lighting wheels on fire.
yeah.
Uh,
As Billy Joel said, we didn't start the fire.
excellent, excellent. So was that the end of your presentation?
Yeah, it is actually. It is.
Excellent. So we'll go ahead and take calls from the audience. There is a Muslim in the chat who says that he can prove that Easter's of pagan origin, and he's been begging for that opportunity. So
All right.
I'm putting the link, theology.chat, in the chat box now. We'll give it a little bit for anyone who wants to come up and discuss with us on topic. You know, we wanted to be discussing Easter today and whether it has pagan origins. No, I don't want to discuss whether the Quran is true or whether Islam is true or anything else of your objections to Christianity today. I'm happy to discuss those a different time, but I want to keep this stream focused on the subject of the day, which is whether or not Easter has a pagan origin or is influenced by pagan ideas, or are some of the customs are copied from paganism. However you want to phrase that, that is the subject today. So we did have someone
Right.
who joined very late, who I believe is a Christian. Marissa Kennedy said, some concepts used in Easter are Christian, like Jesus being resurrected. Some are adapted from pagan roots to Christianity, such as rabbits and eggs. and some are new traditions like eating fish. I assume Marissa wasn't here when we talked about rabbits and eggs, but you want to give a brief summary of what the evidence shows.
Yeah, the evidence just shows that they are also just new traditions that developed without any pagan traditions that came beforehand. We simply do not have any traces whatsoever to pagan traditions that came before the Christian traditions of the Easter bunny and of the Easter eggs and so on. And therefore, there is no good basis to say that is connected to that.
And from Clo-Clo, so do any Christians celebrate Jesus' resurrection with eggs? I guess that kind of means, depends on what you mean by celebrate. I mean, do Christians, and hold on a second, Ultimate Light. I can hear you, so you're connected good. Just hold on a second. So if by celebrate, you mean, do any Christians have any customs related to eggs that they celebrate during Easter time? That's clearly true. If you mean like, is there some sort of deep theology based on the eggs? No. As Marvin explained earlier, the custom derives from old tradition of not eating any animal products during the 40 days prior to Easter, the Lenten season. And because they had no other way to preserve the eggs, they boiled them, and then they had a bunch of eggs to eat at Easter. So they came up with this custom of hiding the eggs to give entertainment to the children, and that is carried forth into modern times. Obviously, we usually use plastic eggs today. We've retained the custom without the reason behind it. We no longer need to boil eggs to preserve them.
Exactly.
Quick question: Did you cover? I came in late because I slept in really late today. But did you cover the legend of Mary Magdalene and the eggs?
I think I actually haven't heard of that one.
Okay, so in the Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a tradition that dates back at least, well, I've heard it dated back to the 11th century. I think it probably dates back a bit earlier than that, that Mary Magdalene was called in front of the emperor and was asked about, because if you notice, all the Mary Magdalene icons in the East have a red egg in it. And in this legend, she's called before the emperor and she's asked to defend her belief that Jesus Christ is God. And she hands the emperor an egg as a symbol, and says that, and talks about Jesus's life and what he was sent for and stuff, and says that his tomb was like the egg, that it looked dead and it looked whole with nothing possible alive in it, and yet out of it, in the resurrection, life came. And so, and then the emperor takes the egg from her and says that, if that's true, then this egg would turn red at this moment, or something like that, and it did. And because of this story, a lot of the eggs are most traditionally painted red. If you notice in the East, the traditional color for Easter eggs is always red. But obviously, just a legend. But I have a strong. Apparently, it was very common, especially in the East, for local priests during their homilies near Easter to hold up one of these eggs that everybody was holding on to, and to use it as an object lesson for for ways in which the resurrection had the appearance of death, but truly had life within, just like this egg here that was just laid by the hen and not boiled yet, obviously, because the boiled eggs are never going to hatch.
Yeah.
So that is.
Patience,
so
ultimately. Patience.
the whole thing with the red egg,
Uh,
as far as my research goes, was, and it is also stated in the source I discussed from Hyde from 1694, I think it was. And he says that the contemporary Mesopotamian Christians do it as sort of a symbol of the blood of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
also talks about the red eggs. So that's the origin story I know. I haven't heard of that
Yeah,
one.
well, that one's much later than the legend. The legend's at least from the 11th century, and most likely priests were using it as object lessons, and it was such a good sermon illustration that it spread. And the reason why specifically it would be dyed red is because it was a symbol of Christ's tomb, and red is traditionally the liturgical symbol for Christ, right? And the Mary Magdalene, I'm curious as to when the earliest Mary Magdalene with an egg icon is, because obviously the story would have to be older than that. But that would be why, because everybody had heard of this legend too, why everybody's dyeing their eggs red as a reminder of the story and of that tradition. But the guy who was a tourist in Mesopotamia, he was like from the 17th or 18th century, I forget which, right? So this is considerably earlier than that. But it's because there were eggs lying around, and people were telling stories about eggs, and they were a great object lesson for resurrection, and they were all just lying around. So that's really where it started. You can't trace it back any earlier than that. But one quick main point that I wanted to make is that whenever people make arguments about it being this symbol of rebirth and of spring and everything else, Easter started being celebrated in the area in which Christ lived, in the Mediterranean. Christ died and was resurrected right before the harvest, right before the grain harvest. The leavened bread is right before what is it? I forget which comes first. I think the barley harvest comes first. During the leavened bread, it ends with the barley harvest, and then right after that, at Pentecost, is the wheat harvest, right? So it's harvest season. It's not winter that was all cold and now spring's coming. It was winter that was, it was dry. They have wet season and dry season and everything else, but it's about to be harvest time. So it has nothing to do with anything spring anyway. So they're imagining that a completely different climate invented this thing that would be very meaningful, supposedly, in an opposite climate that has different experiences with weather, different experiences with seasons, in order to convert people that they'd never heard of, never spoken to, have no knowledge of, just through their mental psychic ability. They know that they're going to do these things to convert these pagans by mixing up and confusing and syncretizing their religions, basically, is the argument. It makes so little sense. This is right before harvest, and all of Christ's, just think about all of his parables. His parables were about harvests. His parables were not about springtime, or renewal of that sort. It was about harvest and judgment. It's very amusing.
So I got a couple quick comments from the audience, and then I'm giving it over to Ultimate Light here. So from Queen, shouldn't people celebrate the resurrection by going to church? I don't know why it's not coming up. There it comes. And yes, absolutely. That is the number one way that Christians will celebrate Easter, is by going to church. That doesn't mean we can't also do other things as well, however.
Absolutely.
And Tamim, the basis of Christianity is pagan. It's not rocket science at this point. I asked him for evidence. He says, your smooth talking is nothing more than a snake oil salesman. You are too sly and convincing to be spreading truth. Now, I've never had anyone call me a a smooth talker. I'm actually a pretty poor public speaker, but leaving that aside, if you have any evidence that Christianity is pagan, let's hear it. After all, if you say that it's so obvious that that anyone should know it, then there must be some evidence behind this. But whenever we look at any of these claims and we go back to the primary sources, we find they don't hold up to scrutiny. So give us some evidence.
Thaddeus, I mean,
all right, Ultimate Light, let's hear your proof.
Okay, firstly,
sources do not matter really in order to say that something is pagan.
Right,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, who needs sources when you got your own imaginary ideas?
It's feelings.
All right, so Ultimate Light claimed that he could prove that Easter is pagan according to the Bible itself. So I'm very interested in hearing his argument.
Firstly, according to the book of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 38 to 40, Jesus says that he's going to die for 3 days and 3 nights. So how can it be that from Friday evening to Sunday morning be 3 days and 3 nights?
I have a presentation
what kind of
for that.
Pause. Ultimate Light, you cannot, when you ask a question, you got to pause and give us a chance to answer it. We can answer that question. However, that has nothing to do whether or not Christianity is pagan or Easter is pagan. Even if Jesus didn't spend 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb, even if he didn't, that wouldn't be about what you're talking about. So are you just going to throw out random arguments, or are you going to be on topic? All right, now give Marvin a chance to answer your question.
Okay. You're asking how it could be that it's 3 days and 3 nights. Since I'm German, sadly this is only in German, but the reference is given, so you can look it up on sepharia.org, .org, sorry. And basically, what is stated here is that any time span of a period of a day and a night, it can be only an hour, for example. If there is only a kind of like a little thing of this time period of the whole day and whole night, it's already counted as a whole day and a whole night. So if Jesus died on the cross on Friday, then we have Friday, full day and full night. It doesn't matter how many hours of the Friday it was. Saturday, the same, and he rose again on Sunday, which is let me speak. And Sunday, the same. It's even if it was just 1 hour, we would have the same, that it is full 3 days and 3 nights, and we see it actually the same thing in the Bible in and of itself. We see it in Josephus, we see it in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud. We see it everywhere in Jewish sources that only a little thing of a time span is also considered a full day and a full night, and that's it.
Yes.
So hang on 1 second. Sepharia, for those who don't know, Sepharia.org is a Jewish site. So according to Jewish custom and Jewish law, Jesus was speaking to Jews. He was speaking to them according to their custom and according to their law. He did die for 3 days and 3 nights by their usage. So according to them, it's correct. Now, what is pagan? Quick, answer my question. What is pagan? Nope. Ultimate Light. You need to answer my question. Stop. What is pagan about Jesus? What is pagan about Jesus using correct Jewish terminology when speaking to Jews? What is pagan about that? Please answer.
I will answer all your questions, but let me finish what I'm saying.
No, we're on one topic.
No, okay. So
Jesus
this is the way things work, Ultimate Light. If you're going to make an argument, don't ask questions.
Completely.
Because you asked us, Ultimate Light, you asked us what the Bible meant. We paused and answered your question. It's a Jewish idiom. A Jewish idiom, according to their way of thinking, the authors of the Bible are Jewish. According to their way of thinking, any portion of the day is described as a day and a night. Yes, I get that that's not the way we speak today, but that's the way the idiom is used in Jewish times in the 1st century.
You know, Jesus never says that he will die for 3 days. No, it says that 3 days and 3 nights. That's what it
We
said.
just-
Sweetheart, that's already
We
been
just
answered.
told, we
He says-
just
he
told
says
you it's
on
a
the
Jewish
third day.
idiom.
On the third day.
So, what is pagan about Jesus speaking correctly about Jewish customs using correct Jewish religious terminology? What is pagan about Jesus using correct Jewish religious terminology? Go ahead, tell us what's pagan about that, because you
If
said
he
it's
said Jewish,
pagan.
that's
Maybe
what he
because
said.
the Jews are pagan.
He
I
said
guess
that
according
I
to
will
him.
be there for 3 days, 3 nights. So it didn't say 3 days.
Yeah, it's already-
Ultimate light. Repeating yourself is not an argument. You can run away and tell us that you smacked us down or whatever nonsense you're going to say in the comments. But if you want to actually have a discussion, you don't just repeat yourself. We explained it's a Jewish idiom. I don't care if you believe us or not. It's time to move on to your next point.
But first he needs to tell us what's pagan. What is pagan about Jesus speaking in a correct Jewish way? So what is it? What's pagan about it?
You know?
No, you're not answering. What's pagan about Jesus speaking in a Jewish idiom to Jewish people? What's pagan about that? You said it's pagan.
So he dropped. I don't know if he intentionally cut or
the
his
same
internet.
thing when it is discussed on one instance that it is said 3 days and 3 nights, and on a different occasion it's said on the third day. So, for example, if we read Esther 4:16, it says 3 days and 3 nights they will fast. But in Esther 5:1, we will see it's on the third day the fast is finished. The same can be observed in 1 Kings 20:29, or, for example, in Genesis 42:17-18, or in Josephus' Antiquities 7.11.6.
So,
Hello, Thaddeus.
like I said, he's historically had internet issues, so I don't know if he intentionally cut off or his internet failed him. But either way, he's not here anymore. So, Idris, you're up.
I lost my train of thought while listening to this guy, but interestingly enough, with what you guys said about 3 days and 3 nights, I did notice that. We also have to remember that in Jewish culture, it is evening then morning rather than morning then evening, so their way of telling the days apart is slightly different than ours, which would make this much easier to understand the whole 3 days thing, because it changes
Yes,
the
that is
order of
also
things.
True, evening to evening, yeah.
So I haven't seen anything else from Tamin in the chat in between when I asked him to provide some evidence in this, and he says, "Ha ha ha, Christians defending Christianity using the Torah."
Because we believe in
Idiots.
it.
Yeah, please explain why that would make us idiots. If we're explaining Jewish idioms using a Jewish text, how does that make us idiots exactly? Plus, Christianity is the continuation of the promises given in the Torah, as well as the rest of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. So I don't know why you think we're an idiot for defending our religion based on the claims of our religion of being a continuation of Judaism.
Well, of course, the Muslims claim that they make no difference between the prophets, and that they believe in everything that was revealed to Muhammad and to all the prophets before him, but they don't actually read anything any of the other prophets wrote. And they don't actually follow anything that any of the other prophets wrote, or believe anything any of the other prophets said. So it's really Islam that's the ridiculousness, the intense ridiculousness.
It is ridiculous. Mainstream Islam is definitely ridiculous. I'll tell you that right now. Yet I have a lot of connection with Islam, as well as Christianity.
So what is the definition of an antichrist according to the New Testament?
One who denies the Father and the Son.
Yep. And does the Quran deny that you can call Allah a father in any sense?
In the mainstream translations, yes. I'll say that right now. Yes. There are some, if we go all points, and then we end up into no, it actually doesn't say that, but that gets overly complicated, and that's not the topic of the video, I don't think.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
We'll save that discussion for another day.
Yeah, we should definitely have it. I encourage you to look at the Arabic and what it says, not at the translations, and see whether or not it actually does say that.
Yes.
Yeah, so Ultimate Light is in the chat. He says, what did I did wrong? Well, if you're referring to why you got kicked off the stream, you weren't kicked off the stream. Either you hit disconnect yourself or your internet failed you, one or the other. I didn't kick you off. If you want to come back up here and try to continue the conversation, that's absolutely allowed. If you mean what did you do wrong in a more general sense, and you admit that you left the conversation, then what you did wrong was not providing evidence for your position and not giving us an argument why Christianity is supposedly pagan. All you tried to do is go to this polemic that, right. Yeah, you just tried to go to a polemic that you knew off the top of your head that had nothing to do with whether or not Christianity copies Easter from paganism, because even if your polemic worked, which it doesn't, right? Even if Jesus was wrong about the 3 days and the 3 nights, which he wasn't, but even if he was wrong, that still has nothing to do with your supposed argument you were trying to make that Christianity is copied from pagan sources, or that Easter is pagan according to the Bible itself, is what you said you were going to argue. So apparently you just wanted to come up here and give some standard polemics and used the topic as an excuse to do so. If the audience has any questions.
I had a...
Good.
What did Marvin say the Easter meant?
The Easter what?
Easter meant the month.
What did the word Easter mean then?
The name, the meaning of the name, or?
Yeah.
It comes from.
Yeah. What's the meaning of the name?
It comes from the root word of the Proto-Germanic Austro, which is in connection to the meaning of dawn and east. So basically, it is connected to the springtime. So if we have the time of the year where the days are getting longer, which we also see in the names of the month of March in both languages, Old High German and Old English, then it is connected to this one that we have the dawn coming up and that we have the sun coming out in the east. And this is how the name of the month has its origin, probably, since the days are getting longer.
That makes sense. And you go first.
Oh, I went as far as there is an atlas that has a list of every single place name that existed in Anglo-Saxon England at Anglo-Saxon English times. So not just in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but that existed anywhere in the on the British mainland, basically. At that time, they listed it. Now, I went through every single one of those looking for any East place names that looked like they appeared to be in the form that you wouldn't get west, north, or south in, right? That they would refer to a goddess. And I couldn't find a single one. I found a few things that are east, but they also had things that were west or south with the same thing. I didn't get anything like the kinds of glades and glens and things that you would get for other pagan names, like if you went to the Woden or something like that. You can get Woden sacred place names all over the place, for example, but nothing for this supposed goddess Oestre that shows that there ever was such a goddess of any sort of notice that anyone cared about her. Easter Wine, which was a name that you had up there, that guy was actually a Christian and was born to Christian parents in a Christian milieu. And so his name may have actually been talking about the Easter celebration, if anything. I couldn't find any. That was the only English name, first name with Easter as a portion of it. You found a bunch of German names that had East as a portion of it, but I couldn't even find any other Anglo-Saxon names except for this one guy who was a monk at that time, and if people had understood his name as referring to a goddess for whatever reason, that would not have been his tonsured name. They change your name very often whenever you become a priest, especially if you had a pagan god as part of your name. So I think his name, his Easter friend name, meant Easter, the celebration that we know, that he was a friend of Pascha, right? That it's a Pascha friend is what his probably meant. It didn't even mean Eastern friend at that point, I don't think.
I finally remembered what I came on here to say. I've noticed that every possible actual meaning for Easter, whether you want to connect it with the East or the sunrise, the dawn, they all have a connection with the Messiah in Judeo-Christian mystic interpretation. Primarily, the righteousness, the morning star, the dawn, all these terms all relate to the Messiah. Interesting that has to do with his resurrection. Is the timing just perfect or what?
I think it's totally coincidental, personally. Lent is another term that's named after the previous season that existed. Lent is another native Germanic word that just got adapted because the celebration fell at that time of year. So no, it's 100% entirely coincidental. Easter fell, or the resurrection celebration fell in the month that happened to be called Easter, and so it picked up the name Easter. Maybe the religious authorities didn't go, hey, we really shouldn't call it that, because it was a fine mental connection, but it's totally coincidental.
Yes, as far as
For a
I
person
can
who
remember,
believes in God, I don't
Lent
think it's coincidence. I
was
think it might be
from
problems
Lent.
at work.
As far as I can remember, the term Lent was also connected to the origins of the Lenzin Mano, which would be the name of March in the Old High German.
Yep. Lent's just named after the month before, and then Easter is named after the month after. So it just picked up the names of the times in which it actually occurred. I don't think that there's any meaning at all behind it. I think if it had been negative, then if it had created like bad theological associations, then maybe the priests would have gone, yeah, let's not call it that, this guys, let's call it such and such, and really encourage people to call it something else. But because it was considered like not harmful, they had no problems with it.
True, that's a good point. But I also think that God might have planned it out like just so that way it works together. That's what I think happened here. Everything's just, it's all clicking into place. It belongs.
That's a little bit German-centric for me, because of only the Germanic languages have this, right? And it's as a percentage of all believers, they're a tiny percent. And a lot of people
Only two Germanic languages.
Right. Well, I think it might. Yeah.
Well,
So
English becoming one of the global languages, so you also have to keep
Yeah.
that in mind. That happened too.
true.
So that might be the reason why this occurred. Hindsight is 2020, and God has future
Right.
sight. So
Yeah. So to be fair to Idris, you're just seeing God's providential hand in all of human history. This is definitely a valid way of looking at history. It's different than what we presented today, but I don't want to say that it's invalid, because Christians have done that often in the past. It's kind of poo-pooed by this academic approach that is popular today. But there certainly would be times in Christian history where they looked and they saw God's hand in everything, even something like this, which looks coincidental to us, right? I don't disagree with Marvin and Mary. It definitely looks coincidental. It definitely doesn't seem like
in terms
evidence
of the
for
human actors,
Christianity.
yes, it would have been
Right,
coincidental.
right,
In
right,
terms
exactly,
of human
right. So
actors,
it
it's
can be both, right?
coincidental, but I
Exactly.
think
It's
it is
coincidental
both.
from a
That
human
makes the
perspective,
most
but
sense.
still has a divine hand in it. All right. So if the audience has any other questions, let us know. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up here. It doesn't look like Ultimate Light is coming back. Such a shame. He said that he could demonstrate Christianity was pagan from the Bible. And when we wouldn't let him keep harping on his point that had nothing to do with paganism, he decided he had no argument to make. Strange. I'll give the audience a couple minutes to ask any questions that you have. Otherwise, I did have this. Oops, sorry, that one I already read. Also from Tamin, the fact you ban people when they speak against you, which is very funny because Tamim is
Who was
speaking
banned?
against me in the chat now. He has been speaking against me from his very first comment. Hasn't been banned. In fact, the only people I ever ban are people who are spamming or people who insist on acting like children, i.e. they just make childish comments, and after being warned, they continue to repeat them. I guess it does technically have to do with the quality of their argument, but it's the opposite. People who make good arguments against me, they are the ones that are most respected. People who just come in here and name call and talk about how ha ha ha, your God poops, or something along those lines, those are the ones that tend to get banned.
it might be an Aladdin fanboy. Aladdin comes on and screams and won't stop screaming and cursing people out, which endangers the stream. So he gets banned because he curses all the time.
All right, I'm not seeing anything from the audience, so we'll give our closing thoughts now. Starting with the two callers, Mary or Idris. Any closing thoughts from either of you?
My closing thought is just how incredibly backward this is to make an insistence that, like, apparently the church fathers are time travelers, for heaven's sakes, or can see the future, and they in the milieu that they're in the Middle East, are invent a holiday that will then appeal supposedly to Germanic peoples that they haven't met, haven't really even heard of, don't know anything about, and supposedly have something to do with this Easter goddess who, as far as we know, didn't really exist and nobody cared about, in order to convert people, as if they had any idea of these people like existing at all. And when all of the imagery of Christ is imagery of harvest, which is, in line with actually where he was and when he was, somehow this is instead about renewal in spring, because they say it is. Yeah. I don't know. These people make no sense to me. So they're giving them magical powers. If they refuse to believe that this was an authentic thing that came about naturally, they are literally giving these folks magical powers of foresight and prediction and insight that no one at that time could have possibly had. So I don't know how this is supposed to show that this is man-made or corrupt, because they were at least, like, I don't know, talking to demons or something to figure out that this would be a strategy that would supposedly work, although we have no evidence whatsoever that this was ever an approach that literally anyone ever took about anything. So that's just my closing thought. It's so incoherent. It just bothers me.
Yeah,
Idris?
they have the future, or maybe Kabbalah. I have no idea how they would figure that one out. Makes no sense. I think the more likely reason is that it connections its name was because of origins of the word, as well as there's nothing inherently problematic with it, so it just kept its name, and that's how things panned out.
All right. Closing thoughts from you, Marvin?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, when we look at all these sources that are claimed as evidence by various groups, we see it's just so much conjecture, and we also see so many forgeries. Like the actual data, the actual evidence is so little that people have to forge sources in order to prove anything. Like even the very existence of this alleged goddess, of which Easter should have derived its name from, even for the existence of this goddess, people have to forge sources. Like that actually shows how poor this evidence is, that there is any connection to anything pagan whatsoever. Like, I wouldn't say there is no even a possibility that there could anything be in that such way, but there is just not any source to prove that, or any source that gives any sort of evidence for that. So if we do not come up with sources that we haven't considered already, then there is just not case to be made here.
Agree. Adam Seeker just popped in the chat. I think definitely go back and watch the whole presentation if you haven't already, and that applies to everyone, not just to Adam. Tons of great information today, but the comment from Adam Seeker, yeah, right, everything is pagan. Only Allah is true. I'll kiss the black stone at Kaaba so that it'll suck my sins away. Always great to see you in the chat, Adam. Serious comment from Carol. Marvin's presentation has been invaluable. Every claim debunked. Thank you. And I had one earlier. I don't remember if I saved it or not. But someone asked if the presentation would be available. Yeah, here we go. The Elder. Will I be able to access this presentation? So that's a question for you there, Marvin. Do you want to make the presentation available to everyone to download?
Yeah, we can try to do that. We'll have to see how that is possible. If we can send you a link to it or something, we'll show. We will take a look at it.
All right. Yep. Marvin and I will talk offline, and we'll get a link up to that if possible. If not, of course, the whole presentation is on the stream, so you can go back and pause and copy the references. I imagine that's why he...
Also, the presentation is for anyone who speaks German on my channel as well in German. I made a...
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, a video of almost 2 hours.
Excellent. Yep. So thank you everyone for joining today. I definitely encourage you to, if you speak German, to check out Marvin's channel. I'm definitely interested in having him on again. So hopefully we'll get some more of these presentations. I found the presentation to be extremely valuable. I know that this isn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea, these very detailed, very in-depth presentations, but they're my favorite. So I'm very glad that we had this today. Get the sources out there for anyone who is interested in the truth. As I joked several times, if you want to believe a conspiracy theory and you want to just repeat these arguments regardless of evidence, well, maybe the evidence doesn't have any effect on you. But if you're actually serious about determining what is the real truth of the matter, very invaluable information. Take this information, write down references, and use it in your discussions with the kind of people who promote these ideas, that Christianity is just copy and paste of pagan ideas. Thank you all for joining us. In about 10 minutes, maybe scheduled for 10 minutes, maybe I'll take more like 15 or 20, but shortly I will be live on my weekly Bible study on the Reasoned Worship channel. I did set up a redirect link, so after I end this stream, you'll automatically get the link in the chat. If you're interested in that, come over and check it out. We'll be going through the Good Friday readings, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and a portion of Hebrews, and the Gospel of John is this year's assigned reading for Good Friday. We'll read through the passages, of course, but then we'll discuss them, look at why we believe that Christianity is the truth. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great week. A very happy Easter. I'll be taking Easter Sunday off, but I will be live tomorrow on Elle's channel. God bless.
God bless.